Hey Strike Eagle fans, Natso is back with you for another in my series of tutorials on the F-15 systems. Today we're going to talk about the long-awaited terrain following radar system. So hopefully it's coming soon, obviously trademarked soon, so we'll see. But RCG, otherwise known as Radar Chicken God, or Gallinet on the Discord, has given me the green light to do a tutorial on the TFR. And if you guys don't know him, he's the guy who's done all the amazing radar work for the F-15E module, both air-to-ground and air-to-air radar, and he's applied his magic to the TFR. So we're going to talk about that, and we'll go through some of the systems. I'm going to do this in a bit of a multi-part series, because there's a whole lot to talk about, and I don't want to bore you for hours. So right now, we're just going to talk through some of the basics of the TFR, the display itself, and actually what it's showing you in some of the cockpit setup. And then we'll go through a flight down low at night so we can see what it does and how it actually works. All right, so just kind of giving you some components of the TFR. Probably the main one that you're going to use to interface with is what's called the E-scope. It's the TF button here in the main menu. So this is what's called the E-scope. I'll go through that in a little bit more detail here in a second. The other aspects are the HUD displays that are going to give you the steering. So there's the up and down. This is the manual box. You'll get an auto little horizontal bar where the airplane will actually follow an auto. Again, I'll get into details in a little bit. Down here, notice we've got the pitch scale. I'm in nav master mode. And these little carets are your bank limit and turn rate carets. And those will actually, these are dynamic, and these will actually move based on whatever mode we set, as well as the bank angle, the G rate that you're actually pulling the jet, and the turn rate as well. And these are to keep you within the limits of the TFR. Some other things to look at is we have the TF kind of status display here in the UFC. It doesn't do anything other than really show you what mode you're in. There's no submenu on it. Again, I'll get into details on that in a minute. The other things I want to show you is down here on the console. So this is obviously the TF radar that you guys haven't played with at all, so to speak. So that obviously needs to be turned standby on the ground when you're doing your cold start to get the pod warmed up on the TF radar side. Obviously, if you're using TF, you probably want the nav FLIR also warmed up. And then once you get airborne, you're going to turn the nav FLIR on to get your FLIR picture in the HUD. And then when you're ready to do TF, you want to go TF switch on. Don't really turn that on until you're ready to do TF. There's no reason to have it on, and it can give you some spurious displays if you're just flying around at high altitude, not doing TF. So basically, this comes on just before you begin to let down into the low level. A couple other switches I want to show you is right here. This is called the TF couple switch. This is how you switch from manual mode to auto. So this will couple the TF to the flight control system and to the basic autopilot. And then there's several other layers of autopilot stuff that you can add on to that. But the basic TF couple is it's just going to fly the up and down pitch, and then you have to steer it left and right to be able to move the airplane and navigate your way along the course. And then one final one is right here on the console. This is called the fly up enable switch. It's a guarded red switch. You can't really see it. See if I can turn the flashlight on. It's up under here. You can't really see the switch. It's defaulted to fly up enabled, which is what you want. You really only ever want to turn it off if you've got some type of flight control malfunction where you have to. It's basically like an emergency mode. So I would just leave it on. You'd have to do some contortions in the cockpit to be able to see it. Obviously, in the real jet, you can reach under there and feel the position of the switch. Doesn't matter which way the guard is. You can have the switch up or down and then close the guard. It's not going to change the position of the switch. So I would just leave it enabled. Obviously, you can bind it to your controls so you can change it if you want to, because it's a bear to get down under here. Even in the real jet, it's really hard to see. All right, so let me turn that flashlight back off. And then same thing in the back cockpit. Turn this off. Sorry. So back cockpit, you can see I've got a typical TFR. Sorry, let me get that from being unlatched to my mouse. This is a typical display setup that a Wizzo would fly. Again, you can customize it any way you want it, but we almost always have the nav FLIR HUD selected up on the left MPD, radar or whatever sensor we're actively using up here on the right MPD, because especially if you're right-handed, I like to do all the action stuff on the right, display stuff on the left, and then you can swap the E-scope either side on the MPCD, but I typically like it here on the right. A lot of people I know like to have it right here on the left, so they can easily compare it to the HUD display. But again, all personal preference. So let's jump back in the front seat. And again, this is just a repeater display, or sorry, not a repeater, but both of the pilot and Wizzo can control this, just like any other MPD. That the buttons are active in both cockpits. So let's go back. So we kind of ran through a typical setup. For the pilot, typical setup is going to be usually the air-to-air radar up here on the left that we're used to seeing. E-scope up here on the MPD up on the right, and then a TSD down on the lower display. For the purpose of the video, I'm going to put the TSD here on the left scope so I can zoom in and not have to look down at the MPD. What I want to do is kind of give you an overview of the route that we're going to fly. So we're here on the NTTR map. We're going to fly over some water for some specific reasons, and then we're going to overfly Vegas. And you can see what the TFR sees for terrain and buildings. And then we're going to get into some high terrain that you can see where the TFR is going to really make your money at night. Again, TFR is really only necessary if you are pre-night vision goggles. So that's why the TFR and the nav FLIR are important to work together. I've got some moonlit illumination so you can kind of see what the TFR is seeing. Later on, I'm going to turn this into a black hole so you can see that it's going to be super dark and the TFR is going to take care of you. If you're flying NVGs, you don't need any of this. You can fly around almost as if you're a visual low-level daytime. So the guys that fly at night with NVGs don't necessarily have the TFR up and running. They might have it as kind of a backup, but my understanding is they don't really use it if they're doing night NVG low-level stuff. But we're going to do old school and pretend that we're probably 2000 before NVGs came into the Strike Eagle, and go from there. All right, so let's get in a little bit more in depth on the E-scope, because this is where the bread and butter is going to be. So let me zoom in on it here a little bit, and I'll leave the UFC visible so you can see it. So taking a little bit of a tour around the scope. Up here along the top are what's called the set clearance planes, or SCPs, or oftentimes just called set clearance. This is the altitude that you're going to tell the TFR that you want it to program to fly at. Default is 500 feet. You can just touch the push button. There's no HOTAS for any of these, so this is all push button stuff. So if I want to go 200 feet, it'll program that. Notice the little manual box is dropping down because now it's commanding you to a lower altitude. There's 300 feet, a little bit lower, 400 feet, 500 feet, and then 1,000 feet. It's going to command you to climb, because right now I'm at 500, essentially just under 600 feet. All right, so this is what you're going to set, and there's one other option. You can go down to 100 feet, but you can only access that if you select if you select the VLC, which is called very low clearance. So if I select VLC, notice now the 100-foot option shows up, and then I can select it. I don't have to fly 100 feet on VLC. I can fly any of these, but it just gives me the additional 100-foot altitude. I'll get into some limitations of this later on. If I select any other mode besides VLC, notice the 100-foot goes away. That's no longer an option. If I'm in LPI, which is called the low probability of intercept, this is kind of like, hey, I want to sneak in under Soviet radar, and they might have detectors looking for my TF. So this gives you a much desensitized picture, and you only have 500 or 1,000 feet because you have a high likelihood of hitting the rocks if you try to go any lower, because it's a much slower scan, uses different type of scan mechanizations, and it's a much more desensitized picture. You also have weather. So weather 1 is let's say I've got rain showers out there and I'm starting to get some clutter on the e-scope, I can select that. Again, you've got all the normal pictures, but what it does is it desensitizes it a little bit. And then ECCM is electronic countermeasures. This is if you start seeing jamming on the scope. Let's say I'm flying around in norm, which is the one that you're going to be flying probably 99% of the time for most normal applications. What you're going to see is, and you're probably not going to ever see it in game until jamming becomes more mature. But the way you'd recognize jamming in the e-scope is you start seeing blotches of like clouds of these returns kind of all over the scope. If you saw that, just blink it over to ECCM, and that should take away a lot of that stuff. But again, in DCS, it's not going to really show. There's another weather mode. I'm not sure if he's got it enabled yet, but there's also weather. Yeah, there we go, weather 2. This desensitizes it even further. This is no kidding if I've got like really heavy rain showers and I've got no other choice, and I would only ever use this in combat. In training, we would never go to weather 2 just because it reduces the range that the e-scope is actually programming, so the heavy rain showers are not going to really see. So I can just select that by toggling that. Notice if I go to weather 2, just like on LPI, I've got 500 and 1,000 are my only options just to give you that safety margin. But let's go back to norm. All right, and then the other thing on here is this is called the soft ride or hard ride. This is how you're going to set the level of performance of the TF. So the way the TF works is it sees the terrain out ahead of you, and it will, at a certain distance, it will start programming a climb to maintain that set clearance. So let's say I've got 500 feet set. It will try to maintain 500 feet over the highest peak and then start descending you down the backside. So it always uses about 2 Gs for the pull-up, and it's not an abrupt pull-up. So it's going to see the terrain from far enough away that it's going to give you a nice gradual 2G climb to clear it, and then it's going to give you a negative G pushover on the backside. This is where the roller coaster of the TF really comes in. So on the pull-up, on the positive side, soft ride or hard ride has nothing to do with it. So it's always going to be 2 Gs. It's only on the backside of the hill or the mountain that is where the difference comes into play. So soft ride is going to give you about a half a G. Technically, out of the book, it's 0.45 negative G pushover. And if I select hard ride, it's going to give you about a 0.9 negative G pushover. And that's, having done that a lot, in real life, it's pretty abrupt. You better have your seat belts or your shoulder harnesses strapped in pretty good, or you're going to bang your head against the canopy pretty hard. So we typically flew in hard ride just because it minimizes the ballooning over a hill, because it's going to give you that much harder push down. And while 0.9 negative Gs doesn't sound like a lot, it actually is in real life is pretty abrupt. And then right here is the radar channel. It's totally independent from the actual air-to-air or air-to-ground channel. But again, this is important because if you're flying in a formation and other guys are flying TF, just like on the regular radar, you want to deconflict those radar channels so you don't start interfering with each other and getting false returns. So you can change the channel up and so forth. All right, so that's the tour around the edge of the scope. Let's talk about what I'm actually seeing out here. So and this is really important to understand what these things are doing. So all these little like waterfall displays, this is what's called the raw video that the TF radar is actually seeing the terrain out ahead. It's important to understand that and this is what's called the raw video position indicator. So you can actually see the radar scanning left and right. So it scans left and right and up and down. What am I trying to say? So as it scans the full width of this area, it's taking a snapshot and it's storing the video on either side of the scan, but it's only showing you this terrain in a very narrow little slice right off the nose. So it's using a composite of what it sees in the stored stuff. So this little slice, can think of it as like a super narrow slice immediately off the nose, but it has already stored stuff off to the sides, which is why I can give you some warnings later on that we'll get into. So this line right here is called so this is the raw returns. This line right here is called the synthetic returns. This is what the TF is actually using. So the raw returns are just for your SA, just informational only. The radar, or the TF system doesn't use these raw returns for anything other than just display of them, just to give you a warm fuzzy that what you see out the front when you're looking through the nav FLIR, that when you start seeing these returns, that you can actually tell that it makes sense. But but this line, it's usually really fine dots. It's called the synthetic return, and this is what the TF radar is actually programming. This horizontal line right here, consider this the flight path marker of the jet. So this is the same thing as the velocity vector of the jet, up and down only, obviously not left and right. So as the jet moves up and down, this will move up and down in relation to the terrain. Also notice that the range scale is not a linear range scale. It's you guys will probably crucify me if I get this wrong, but it's a logarithmic scale. So there's a mile here because you want things that are really close to you want it at much higher fidelity. And as it gets further away, it starts getting compressed. So it's from 0 to 10, but as the scale gets further out, these range scales are not linear. This line is what's called the zero command line. This is what the jet is going to use to program the up and down of the terrain, or of the jet pitch commands based on where the terrain is. So if that line is riding right on the terrain, then that means the jet is flying at the correct set clearance plane. If, as we see it right here, it's actually above, that means that we're flying high of the terrain, which, as I showed you, we are about 80 feet higher than what's programmed. And if that line is below the terrain, below the zero command line, below the synthetic returns, then the jet is actually below the set clearance plane. It's below whatever I have set. And realize that as I change this, notice that rises up, which means that I'm now much higher. I need to start pitching down, also following that, right? So you can see that as I go. But I'll leave it at 500 because that was kind of the norm. This line is what's called the obstacle warning line. This is the oh shit. If that line comes all the way down and is touching that terrain, that means you're about to hit the rocks, and you probably have already gotten a fly-up warning, or about to get a fly-up warning at that point. So this is the no kidding, I'm about to crash into the ground. If this OWS, or obstacle warning line, is now coming down to where this terrain is. So hopefully we never see that. But if the zero command line, which is here, is riding on that terrain, that means we're at the correct altitude. What we're really following is this pitch command. So let me zoom back out. So let me zoom out here a little bit so you can see the relationship between the HUD and the e-scope. So this little open box is the same as this open box. And this is telling me that I'm in manual, because notice I didn't have that TF couple switch on, which means now when I fly the airplane as the pilot, my goal is to keep the flight path marker inside or above that box. Never have it below the box, which means I'm now flying below the commanded set clearance plane. If I get too low, I'm going to hit the ground. So if you fly around in manual, you want it to be inside that box, absolutely no lower than the bottom of the box. And most pilots' technique would be to have the flight path marker kind of in that upper part of the box, just to have a little bit of a safety margin. But that's a technique only. Later on, when we turn it to auto TF, that box will turn into just a solid horizontal line, and now the jet will automatically fly itself. You can take your hands off the stick, cross your arms, and now you watch the airplane fly. We're going to fly, and initially we're going to fly in manual for a little bit, just to see what's going on. So again, that little box, so to speak, corresponds to the container in the HUD. Finally, one more thing on interpreting the terrain. Notice we're flying over water right now, and you've got hills in the background. So that's exactly what the TF scope is showing. So water always shows as a no return. Water is very reflective of radar energy, so we're not really getting any returns back. So this is all black, which means the radar is not seeing anything, which is very accurate. Then out here, roughly at about, call that 5 miles or so, it's starting to pick up the shoreline, and that's where you're starting to see the terrain. If you see a little gap in the terrain, which I'll show you as we fly later, that probably means there's a peak right here, and the radar cannot see beyond it, so it's showing you a shadow. So think back on the air-to-ground map when you're looking in RBM or HRM, and you've got a big black shadow behind the ridge line. That's exactly what that gap is showing. So you've got probably a peak here, with nothing but the shadow behind the peak right there. So it's not going to show the little vertical jagged edges like a regular mountain, because remember, this is kind of giving you a little slice of that. So it takes a little bit of getting used to interpret the e-scope, but once you do, it makes a lot of sense. So let's go ahead and fly, and we'll take a look at what it looks like. So remember, I'm flying in manual, so I want to fly to keep that flight path marker in the box. The other thing is I can bank. So if I'm in norm, notice I can bank right up to the edge of those carrots. And notice if I roll too quickly, I'll get a turn excel warning. So turn excel, which means I'm rolling faster than I need to. Or if I start pulling too hard, I'll get a turn rate warning, right? So essentially that's telling me to, hey, cool your horse or cool your jet, slow down a little bit. So, and notice if I exceed that, I get a flight warning, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So notice as I fly, those carrots are dynamic, and those will change as I put G on the jet. So notice as I pull,
low altitude,
those carrots shrink. Let me put it on pause for 1 second. One thing I wanted to talk about, a good technique is if I've got 500 foot in the set clearance plane, set your low altitude warning to 90% of whatever that altitude is, so you're not always getting low altitude warnings at the right number, right? So if I'm at if I set 400, so 90% or take 10% off of that, so it'd be 360, and so on. If I were at 200 feet, I would take it would be 180, and so on. If I were at 100 feet, I would take 10%, so I'd set 90 feet in the low altitude warning. That way, it's not too low, but it gives you a little bit of margin of error on that. And then one final thing, remember I told you the TF display on the UFC, all it does is shows you the mode that you're in. So notice if I change that, it just changes that as I go. All right, so let's go back and fly. So let's see if I can do a turn. Notice the big thing here is the turn is probably the most limiting aspect of the train flying. I can't just yank the airplane like that. I'll probably get a fly up, which I just did. So notice that doesn't work. So TF is very limiting in that you've got to fly within those TF limits, especially in terms of the bank and the G's. So every time it gives you a little bit of warning. So if it sees that warning for 2 seconds or more, it'll give you the fly up. If I say it just briefly, it'll give me a little bit of margin. Notice I'm getting an airspeed caution. So you have to be greater than 400 ground or greater than 360 indicated. And again, I'll get into why we're getting those fly-ups later on. And again, I'm exceeding that turn rate by more than the 2 seconds. Let's see if we can get back here, back on course here.
Low altitude, low altitude.
Yeah, go ahead and change my steer point to a little bit further down the line. If I change my set clearance plane, let's go down to 200 feet. Notice it's now going to program that container back down, and then it's going to dynamically calculate based on what terrain it sees.
Low altitude.
Notice I'm getting no terrain, which means it's not seeing anything. And again, this is where planning comes into play. Is you've really got to pay attention to the turn rate and the G. So let's go ahead and push back down. Notice it's giving me that negative 9G.
Pull up. Low altitude, low altitude.
And I exceeded that. The other thing is if you do want to maneuver, you can paddle switch the fly up off. Again, I'll get into details on that. And you can, so right now if I paddle and hold, I'm unarmed and I can now roll as I want to without getting that fly up warning. Obviously, you want to get above the MEA or the min safe altitude, min en route altitude to do that. So again, as long as I'm holding the paddle switch down, and then as soon as I let go, it'll give me the normal stuff back. So let's go ahead and get back down.
Low altitude. Low altitude.
So let's notice I've gotten a little bit low, so I'm going to come back up and fly in that box. Coming over Vegas right now. See, notice as it's going down the little valley, we're getting into the little valley. I'm going to put it on pause here real quick. So here, what I want to show you is see how there's a little ridge line right in front of the jet, and there's probably a valley behind it, which is where the Vegas Valley is. Notice there's no terrain behind that shadow, so that terrain is about 1.5 miles away, which is this right here. That's why I can't see beyond it. And then as I climb up over that mountain, you'll start picking up that further ridge line back here. That'll start showing up on this. It's freaking out because I'm on active pause, so it wouldn't do that if I were flying. Notice that it'll start calming down. So I'm going to continue to honor the flight container. Boom, let me pause it. So notice now as it climbed over that terrain, it can now pick up the terrain back here in the background.
Low altitude. Low altitude. Low altitude.
Push it over so there's
low altitude. Low
but
altitude. Low altitude.
And this takes a lot of concentration. So if you fly manual, the pilot is pretty much only staring at the box. The cool thing is the RCG has programmed buildings and towers to calculate in this, so it does a really good job of picking up buildings. So let's test this out. And I think it only works if you have that advanced radar altimeter thing selected. So it's starting to give me a program in a flat valley, but it's programming me above that building right there. Probably another building that I just flew over. Yep, so there's the program up. So it's taking me up over the building. Perfect.
Low altitude.
And then as soon as it clears the building, it's going to give me the pushover. Pretty abrupt pushover.
Low altitude. Low altitude. Low altitude. Low altitude.
Okay, and I didn't follow my own advice. Let's go ahead and set that down to 360 on the laws, just so I don't get it bitching at me all the time. So now, again, this is important. So if you look at the E-scope over here, you can see, let's go ahead and put it on pause. You can see it's seeing that terrain, but nothing behind it, because again, it can't see past that because everything behind that is in shadow. And that's exactly what that's programmed. So there's probably a little peak or a little ridge line right here, which is why you're seeing that gap behind it. And then you're seeing the taller ridge line in the back, and then you're seeing the gap behind that. So that's exactly what the E-scope is seeing. Now, let me put it on pause, and we'll go ahead and do the auto TF. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and zoom in. We'll go ahead and couple this up. So now that switch is enabled. We'll take it off pause. Now, notice in auto train following, this pitch command bar is now the solid horizontal bar, and now you can't see me, but I'm going to take my hands off of the jet in terms of the pitch. So now the jet is flying itself, and auto is obviously preferred because it's a lot more precise and quicker than the human pilot. However, I can still steer it left and right, so I'm just basically rolling the jet. So this is called command stick steering. And the same thing would happen if I exceeded those limits. Turn rate for more than two seconds.
Low altitude.
So I'm back within.
Low altitude. Low altitude. Low altitude.
Got a great big ridge line coming up. So there's my 2G pull. Notice I can't see beyond that ridge line. So we're right out here at the Red Rock big cliff face, and then as soon as that comes over the backside, it'll do a very abrupt pitch down to once it can see terrain on the backside. So now it's starting to pick up those ridge lines in the back. Boom. There it is.
Low altitude.
I'm going to control stick steer, get down here in the valley. This is the most optimum way to do it. And again, I'm just steering left and right with the stick. I'm not doing any pitch up and downs. Okay. So now, notice on the autopilot, even though I don't have the autopilot turned on, because it's using the basic autopilot for the up and down TF, the message over here is saying autopilot is just in basic TF mode. Okay, and you'll get it also up here. Notice I don't have anything else selected. So now if I want to do steer mode and have it follow the nav steering, this is now where I would go ahead and pre-select it. So I'll go autopilot on. So there's autopilot on.
Low altitude.
And now it's going to start picking up the nav steer mode once it can fly that.
Pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up.
Low altitude.
See, now it's beginning to turn to steer 6. And now notice it says nav, autopilot nav and TF. We go out to the main thing. That way you can see what mode it's in just from the top of the UFC display.
Low altitude.
So that's pretty cool.
Altitude.
So now it's going to fly, it's going to do its best to fly the route within the bank angle limits as best it can.
Low altitude. 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 Low altitude.
Shut up.
Low altitude.
And again, if I want to hand fly the airplane and take it out, then I just go paddle switch. That decouples the autopilot. And then if I let go of the paddle switch, it puts it back into basic TF mode without being coupled to the nav steering. So to get it back in, I have to paddle switch and release, and it should go back to that mode.
Low altitude. Low altitude.
I'm sorry, I said that wrong. You have to now push the autopilot button to go back into the nav steering. So again, let me do that one more time. So paddle switch. Now I can fly the jet without any TF protection. It says unarmed. If I let go of the paddle switch, it just goes into basic TF. So it's basically just going to, I can still roll left and right, which is what I'm doing with the stick. And then if I want it to fly the steering, I have to go down here to autopilot, turn that on, see how autopilot comes up. And now it says,
Low altitude. Low altitude.
oh, shut up, Betty. Now it says nav steering is nav and TF. Cool. All right, so one more thing I want to show you, and I purposely flew this in the high terrain. Let me go ahead and select VLC, and I'm going to select 100 feet. So notice now, this is why VLC is really not your friend, because notice now the pitch, I'm going to go ahead and take it off of nav coupled steering. Notice now the roll limits are much more constrained because at 100 feet I've got such little margin for error that it can't do much roll. All right, so this is really important that it may sound really cool to fly around at 100 feet, but it's very, very restrictive. If I go beyond that turn rate, boom, I get a fly up. The airplane will just keep climbing away from the ground. So now this is a good segue to go ahead and talk about what does fly up mean. So let's go ahead and show you what that means. So now I'm holding the paddle switch, which means I can maneuver at will because I'm above the MSA, or in theory the limits. So let's say I want to go ahead and couple it back up. Again, I'm basically in the basic nav mode. What it's going to do is if it actually, let me take it off of auto TF because I can demonstrate the procedures better.
Low altitude. low altitude.
So let's say I exceed the
pull up,
altitude by a certain amount. Notice it will protect me by doing a fly up. So it says, hey, dummy, you're about to hit the ground. It automatically pitches the jet up away from the ground. There's other times where the fly up comes into play. So altitude is once. If I get below a certain percentage of my set clearance plane, it'll kick in. I already showed you the roll rate. So if I go exceed that for 2 seconds, boom, there's a fly up. So if I get either the turn caution, the roll rate caution, or the turn excel caution, it will give me the fly up. And the way I get out of the fly up, let's go ahead and do that one more time.
Obstacle ahead. Low
Boom.
altitude.
And
Low
I
altitude.
did that on purpose
Over
because
G.
there's a
Over G.
point where the jet can't handle it. So if you over task the system, it won't have time to recover, which is what I purposely did to put it in there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to redo that mission. I'm going to turn the moon off, and now you're going to be able to see what it actually looks like.